Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for the great introduction. I actually didn't expect that you introduced me so long. But I started this position this year, so it's a rather new function in Estonia to do this cyber policy development at the ministerial level. But today, this afternoon, in this session, we talk about silent battle strategies. And under this smart title, we have actually three topics. First, how countries have developed their offensive cyber capabilities over the years. Second, whether or not it is reasonable to expose an attacker during a cyber conflict. That's the second topic. And the third one is, what are the military cyber operations other than war? And for these topics, we have three great panelists. First, Dr. Max Smeets, who is a research fellow in cybersecurity at Stanford University, and he is also a non-resident cybersecurity policy fellow at University of Oxford. Then we have Ms. Gil Baram from Israel, who is the head of research at Yuval Nieman, I hope I got the name right, workshop for science, technology, and security. And she's also a research fellow at Tel Aviv University. And the third panelist is Mr. Brad Bigelow, who is the principal technical advisor to the Deputy Chief of Staff, Cyberspace at SHAPE. And for you who don't know what SHAPE is, it is a Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. So now it's clear. And Brad has been intimately involved in the development of the concept and structure for the proposed Cyberspace Operations Center at SHAPE. And now you already know what SHAPE means. Before we start with the presentations, let me ask first that how many of you is actually working in the military/defense sector? Could you just raise your hand? Okay, thank you very much. So I see that approximately half of the auditorium already knows the topics, but the rest maybe are not so familiar with this topic. So we just have to keep it in mind while presenting the topics and also having this discussion. About the structure of the session, first we are going to have three presentations. Each presentation takes about 10-15 minutes, or a little bit more. And after each presentation, we have a little bit time for immediate questions. And after all presentations, we have about 40, I hope we have at least 40, 35 minutes for discussion and more questions. And now we can start actually with the presentations. The first is done by Max, and he will talk about the development of offensive cyber capabilities among NATO countries. And actually, before you start your presentation, let me ask you that why do countries actually need cyber offensive capability? And let's exclude the wartime situation. That, of course, when there is a war, then we know that there is military forces should have offensive capability. But is there other reasons as well? That if there is no war, it's normal peacetime, do countries actually need offensive cyber capability?
Would you like me to answer it now?
Yeah, exactly. Just answer, then I let you hear.
I didn't expect that. So let's be very clear here on what we mean with capabilities, right? Does the military need C&D, C&E, C&A? Does it need defense capabilities, espionage operation capabilities as well, maybe for the military for a variety of reasons, and then attack capabilities? I think in all these three cases, you can make a strong argument that there are some opportunities for that. I will raise a few during the presentation. But one of the key ways that we have to think about it is, of course, that much of the activity that takes place below the threshold of armed attack And for that, we might have to cause friction, as I will discuss in this presentation, to potentially disrupt adversarial activity as well. And for that, potentially military cyber operations are a good tool. I'll touch upon it a little bit more detail. This question caught me off guard, I have to say.
Yeah,
but
that's good actually. So we can have better interaction. And if you have questions from the auditorium, feel free. So let's try to keep it as interactive as possible.
Thanks, Raoul. So actually, for this session, I'm going to talk less about NATO members' organizational path towards conducting offensive cyber operations, and more about NATO members' cooperative path, or potential cooperative path, towards conducting offensive cyber operations. And as a starting point of analysis, I'm going to take the US strategy of persistent engagement and defend forward. Here is the argument that I'm going to lay out for you. First, US cyber strategy of persistent engagement and defend forward, implemented last year officially, is a fundamental change in strategy. It seeks to operate seamlessly, globally, and continuously. That also includes potentially operating in allied networks. Now, of course, the US and allies and other actors have always operated in allied networks. We have to be honest about that, in two ways. One, as an observer, potentially collecting intel, and two, as a passerby, going through those networks to potentially get into adversarial systems and networks. But now it has changed because it seeks to be achieving effects, being a disruptor as well to cause friction. Adversaries, I'm going to argue, this type of activity will potentially lead to what I call allied friction, loss of confidence, and trust. Adversaries can exploit this friction. They don't act randomly. In the future, as other countries will adopt their strategy, the US can equally become a battleground for allies. And so I'm going to come up with a concrete proposal that is a NATO Memorandum of Understanding on CNA. So a rather, hopefully, provocative argument, or hopefully, at least I think it is, but also a concrete way to potentially move forward. Let's take each step in turn here. So first, about the US strategy, for those of you who may not know. We saw two key documents being published in 2018, the US DoD cyber strategy, and before that, the Cyber Command vision. The Cyber Command vision, talking about persistent engagement, and the DoD strategy primarily focusing on defend forward, although these concepts have then be linked. The fundamental notion underlying the strategy, I think, is an important one, and an accurate one too, that actually the most focus in the past has been on this high and right activity, potentially attacks that can destroy or degrade critical infrastructure and so on. And yet what we see today, the majority of activity takes place below the threshold of armed attack. However, the activity that does take place below the threshold of armed attack, those operations linked into broader campaigns, can still be strategically meaningful. The cumulative effect of those can still have significant implications for great power competition or beyond for the international system. That's the change, the fundamental change in also thinking about what we see in this space and potentially what needs to be dealt with, right? And so if this is a space of constant contact where actors can constantly engage and seek to create advantages over time and not just through one single catastrophic event, the argument then of US Cyber Command and DoD is to, hey, we need to persistently engage with the enemy, with the adversary. And so one of the key principles that is, then comes up, and I'm quoting here from the vision, highlighted in bold also in the strategy, is that US Cyber Command needs to operate seamlessly, globally, and continuously. The idea is to be where the adversary is, to minimize their freedom of maneuver, and not just deter, but also to cause inherent friction in the operations that are going on at a specific moment in time. And we see this also across a number of other publications around this. General Paul Nakasone has a very interesting article in Joint Forces Quarterly, and several other publications of key people which have helped writing this strategy as well. To quote another, point to another quote, so in the strategy, we'll see this statement: superiority through persistence seizes and maintains the initiative in cyberspace by continuously engaging and contesting adversaries and causing them uncertainty wherever they maneuver. The goal is to operate as close as possible to the adversaries and their operations. As close as possible is important, right? It's not just at the source, but as close as possible. What it implies is that the US Cyber Command seeks to achieve effects that are, one, outside of its own networks, but also beyond or outside of the networks of its adversaries. Now, that vast space, that is not ungoverned space, of course. We're not talking here about, I don't know, some vacuum. We're talking here about specific things such as routers in Nairobi or servers in Denmark, and so on, right? And some of that is, of course, based in Allied territory. Cyberspace always touches ground somewhere. As I mentioned, the US and also other actors have always operated in this space for a wide range of good reasons, potentially, it could be argued, right? We think about being an observer, an active intelligence collector, and even doing fourth-party intelligence, collecting intelligence in allied networks to acquire more information about what adversaries are doing in those networks, and so on. Nothing new here. There's also nothing new when we think about this kind of notion of passerby, actually going potentially through what would be described as nodes, allied nodes, to access adversarial networks. Where the difference comes in is following the strategy and its language is in being an active disruptor, and not doing this sporadically or regionally, but doing this globally, continuously, and seamlessly. I could only come up with one case or find one case before in which I saw this type of behavior. And if you know any other cases, I would love to hear. So Alan Nakashima wrote this report for the Washington Post in May 2017 about an operation that was conducted in late 2016 in which the US wiped servers of ISIS propaganda that were based in Germany. Now, there was some notification process in one way or another that is not described in any detail in the report and also in the following follow-up piece in Cyberscoop. But what was clear is that the Germans were, of course, frustrated by this. So the point here is that what I don't want to say is that operating potentially in this space and doing this instantly or seamlessly doesn't make sense from an operational perspective. You could actually come up, indeed, with a number of really good arguments for doing so. And as was stated, actually, not in the 2018 Cyber Command Symposium, but the one 2 weeks ago in 2019, indeed, opportunities within this domain are fleeting. We might not have months to take something down and go through a long diplomatic process and so on. We might have to act quickly, potentially in allied networks, to cause friction, to reduce freedom of maneuver of our adversaries, and do so constantly, globally, and seamlessly. And in fact, you might also say, in some cases, allies actually don't mind US Cybercom coming in and operating their networks, particularly when there is a high level of trust, when there is a feeling that this will also lead to general defense of that system which it seeks to defend. But of course, the key question here, and the one I want to propose today, is, but what if an allied country is not keen on having the US military in its networks actively, seamlessly, and continuously disrupting an adversary's cyber operations? That's the key question. And so what we've seen today written, and I've written about some of these issues as well, when we think about the implementation of the strategy, and particularly the US strategy, because it was such a fundamental change in strategy last year, we primarily think about what kind of influences this has on great power dynamics, how it influences maybe China, Russian operations, or as was laid out in the DoD strategy, North Korea and Iran. We can talk about escalatory dynamics there and how that can lead to more or less escalation. And we can also talk about setting out norms on how to make sure that potential future conflict between those countries does not occur. And we can all have different views on whether that would work out or not. But really, for this room, for people who are actually thinking about NATO, the key question here is not so much how the strategy actually influences these dynamics. Of course, that's key. But it is actually how does it affect alliance dynamics that we are potentially faced with now and in the future. And so if we take this German case, and if we truly take the strategy and the writings around that and the discussions that have been going on, we will expect to see more of these cases, as I mentioned, in the future. And that also then means that if we want to assess the strategy, we're not just looking, again, at some of these key indicators around deterrence and causing friction, but we have to think more carefully about how it undermines alliance trust and confidence. And those things are much more difficult to measure. These are much more subtle and much less easily observable, of course, potentially diplomatic backlash or friction, and so on. What is an interesting dimension, which is not always realized, is actually when we try to defend forward into potentially allied networks or anywhere else, at least be in those systems where the adversary is and where the adversary operates through, that the adversary obviously doesn't operate randomly. Right? If I would be Russia and I could go either through a country, through a node, from which I know it would cause allied friction, or I could go through a different country, which one would I pick? Well, if I want to cause more friction in an already potentially existing division, I would exactly go through those nodes that cause diplomatic friction. So it's not just that we're trying to defend forward against random acts and see wherever they are, and that's where we're going to go after them. No. Actually, the strategy, if you would read it carefully, might provide adversaries an opportunity to actually further create divisions in an ongoing alliance. The other question that is worth considering, one about the nature of the strategy and how to move forward, is this question, well, what would happen if NATO allies would adopt their own strategy of persistent engagement and defend forward? So not integrate their strategy within US strategy of defend forward and persistent engagement, right? That's not what I'm talking about. But to have their own strategy, so that they also want to operate globally, continuously, and seamlessly, reduce freedom of maneuver of adversaries, cause friction wherever they go before they are in allied networks. What would that entail? Well, that would probably entail that many allies would have to operate in US systems and networks to actually potentially defend forward, because that's where you can expect some of the adversaries to be and operate through. Now, from my feeling is, I don't think that that would be something that the US would necessarily agree with or be happy with. And that brings us to a broader kind of understanding of, I think, where we have to go from here. If this is what we've faced with today, I think there are a number of set of questions that we have to be honest about and have to address exactly in this forum here today and this conference. One point, and I also mentioned it in the paper, which provides a more broad framework around organizational capacity, is of course we have seen the declared launch of a wide range of branch services and units to conduct military cyber operations, and we can debate then what military cyber operations are, and above all, and this goes to the question to address, whether many of these countries which establish an organization actually know what they want to use it for, and whether they have a capacity behind it. So I'm not sure whether if countries would want to have a strategy of persistent engagement, they will be able to. They might declare that they have an organization or command or whatever form of unit of branch. Doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that they have a capacity. But the question still stands because it shows and it gives us a better understanding of the nature of the strategy and how we potentially have to work together. So here's a concrete proposal. The concrete proposal I would like to lay out is that we need a memorandum of understanding between NATO member states concerning cooperation on offensive cyber effects operations, or many of you will conceive of that as CNA, on networks and systems on their territory. I would love to have feedback on the exact nature of this proposal, on what it would include, but I think some of the key building blocks I've put here on this slide. So one, it needs to be for an alliance as a whole, because doing it with just individual countries will exactly create this opportunity for friction and see where we have an understanding and where we don't. So it needs to be an alliance-wide framework, in my view. Second, it needs to have two building blocks. One, it needs a notification framework. So in which cases would it make sense for a country to actually go in to an allied network to achieve certain effects? If, when, and how? Now, I think some will say never. But we need to come up with a notification process, not least to create some predictability and stability. Somewhat of almost a confidence-building measure within NATO, I would say. Right? When can we expect the US to actually go into allied network to do something like that? I think it's absolutely crucial to have more transparency on that. And the second one is not just like we need to think about a notification process. So if you're going to notify the allied states, how are you going to go about that? Not every form of notification is equally good, of course. I don't believe that this necessarily have to be shared, every information around CNA, bilaterally. I think that can be, through the alliance as a whole. I think it can be shared bilaterally. That, of course, has reasons for, like OPSEC reasons and so on. And the sharing, unlike some MOUs on C&D, Computer Network Defense, or C&E, do not necessarily have to be reciprocal. And that's for the simple reason that some will do it more than others. So it doesn't really make sense to have reciprocal sharing here. Thank you for your time, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Max. Is there any questions related to this topic? Yes, there is one. Let's take 2 questions before the next presentation. Just wait a minute for the mic.
Thanks. OK, thank you. Just a question on notification framework. Are you thinking post-facto notification? Because if you're thinking pre-facto, of course, what jumps to mind is opportunities are fleeting in time and space, and for cyber maneuvers, firstly. And secondly, what kind of a paradox does it create where an ally provides pre-notification and the other ally says, no, thank you, stay out of my networks? If you're looking for friction, then I would think that would be a recipe for friction as well, where the requesting allies' own networks are in danger.
Absolutely. I think that's a great comment. So you need to start first with a notification framework before you talk about the notification process, right? We first need to put a framework in place about when and where and how you would actually go in to achieve effects. You need to agree on that. And then second part is to think about the process of doing that. And of course, it needs to be done before. And yes, so like as I put also on this quote, I generally agree that many of the opportunities are fleeting here in this domain, right? But oftentimes they aren't either. And I'm not talking here about month-long processes. But something like ISIS propaganda, surely, like, it's important, rather take it down today than tomorrow. But really, by not taking it down today, I don't know what the serious consequences are for tomorrow. They might be there, but in certain cases they are, and in certain cases they aren't. And I think that's exactly one of the things that should be considered by establishing some form of notification. But it doesn't really exist today. There is very much uncertainty about when that would occur and when that wouldn't occur. And I think it is in the interest of all members of the alliance to have much more clarity on that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Is there any comments by other panelists to this topic? Not at the moment. So let's take another question from the auditorium. OK, if there is not, I have actually another question too. Oh, great. Yes.
So you talked about notification to other nation states, but the interested party here would also include the private sector whose network is being accessed. What role does the private sector have in being having their network used?
I think that's a terrific question.
Brad, it's actually a much worse question that they ask you first. It's good. Much more difficult.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a very fair question because, of course, most of the networks through which an adversary would operate are not MIL networks. And so it will have to require some kind of layered approach where you will have to notify the private sector as well around these issues. The honest answer right now is how you would go about that and what kind of layered approach you want to have in terms of notification and how it changes dynamics depending on the official status of that company, where it is officially located, its headquarters, and so on, I wouldn't know. So I think it's a very fair point, and I thought about it before, but I can't give you a perfect answer on how you would establish a process right now to deal with that in terms of communication.
OK, thank you very much. Let's leave other questions to after all presentations. So the next presenter will be Gil, and she will talk about whether or not it is reasonable to expose an attacker during a cyber conflict? And I have actually a surprising question to you as well. So if you, as a person, working in the cyber domain, everybody knows that you're the cyber person, probably. And if suddenly you notice that somebody has hacked your computer, and the attacker probably has gotten some information, and finally he or she has closed access to your computer, are you willing to, expose this situation? Are you willing to talk about that to other people, that you as a cyber person got hacked?
I think I will try to answer by the things I'm going to talk in the presentation.
It's very simple answer, yes or no.
OK, so yes, and I think as I will show next, I will have I will gain many benefits from it, from saying, although I'm a cyber person, I've been attacked, and that would happen, and now let's see what I can do with it, and I think I should do it, right? And if I won't expose it, and maybe someone else will reveal it or something like that, I'll be embarrassed,
So actually, I know that the answer is not so simple, yes or no. So you can actually have no possibility to present the theory behind the question. So please.
OK, thank you very much. OK, so thank you. I would like to thank the organizer first for having me here. This is my first time at CyCon, and I'm very excited to be here and present my research. What I'm going to present in the next 14 minutes, maybe less, is a part of broader research, which is based on my PhD research. In the larger project, I'm dealing with the victim-attacker dynamic during cyber conflict. And in this paper, in this presentation, I will present to you some insights regarding only the victim side. And in the paper in the book is co-authored with Dr. Udi Zomer from Tel Aviv University. So, let's see. OK. So, mainly when we think, or when we usually think about cyber attacks, we think about certain aspects like the anonymity and secrecy that these attacks allowed for both attacker and victim, and about the problem of attribution that was discussed earlier. And that can lead us to expect that mainly victims of cyber attacks won't be so hurried to expose the attack and blame their attacker. As you asked me, the countries might be embarrassed to reveal their vulnerability. They might suspect that if they will reveal the fact they've been attacked, they will be attacked again. And we can expect that many countries will choose to keep it silent and not go public about the attack. But reality, as we know from recent years, shows us a different picture, in which, in many cases, countries that were attacked choose to reveal the fact they've been attacked and expose the attacker. And that leads us to the main research question of this study, which is mainly why. Why and under which geopolitical circumstances they choose to go public and reveal the attack, the fact they've been attacked. In order to understand that, let's first take a look at the victim's decision-making process. OK, so this is a cyber attack, right? And first, let's see if it works. No? Yeah, great. First, the first question is, if the attack, did the attack was detected or not? If the victim has strong cyber capabilities, cyber defense capabilities, he should detect the attack. Okay, so this is the first question. Once the attack has been detected, the second question is, which strategy should it choose? If it decides to remain covert it's a different story, which I'm not going to talk about it now, but I'm talking about it a bit in the paper. But if the victim chooses to go public, then again, it has two options: to attribute the attack to a specific attacker or not. And now, let's take a moment to look about the bigger picture, the bigger analytic framework we offer. So first, we see that there are two strategies which are public, which I'm going to discuss, and two which are not. Okay? So we're talking only about the public strategies and the motivations, the reasons for the victim to choose each strategy. So first, the first one is to publicize the attack and accusing the attacker and attributing the attack. So the first reason that we examine is we call it the naming and shaming, which is not actually a reason, it's a tactic with many benefits for the victim. Okay? By naming and shaming the attacker, the victim, as we saw in many cases, and especially led by the US, the victim can gain international support for action by naming and shaming the attacker. The victim can say, I know who did it, I've been attacked, I need to act, and he can gain international support of imposing sanction and retaliate, maybe. And the other reasons we identified are, the first one is saving face, and the second one is setting the narrative. And we saw that, I will discuss soon in the DNC hack, but we saw that when the victim decides to go public, he might be humiliated by revealing its vulnerabilities, but at the same time, he said, this is what happened, I've been attacked, and I know how to deal with it. Okay, I'm ready, and I know how to deal with it and how to fix my vulnerabilities. Okay, and that helps the victim even to set the narrative and maybe become, again, like the US case, like in the DNC case, becoming like a world leader in dealing with cyber attacks, okay, publicly. And the last reason is sending a message, signaling. By revealing the attack and accusing the attacker, the victim sends a message, I know you did it, and I'm going to respond in a way, in a time that I will choose, okay? And the second strategy is publicizing the attack without attributing it to a certain attacker. And in this case, we ask why, if we saw in the first strategy, we saw that there are benefits for accusing the attacker publicly. In certain cases, countries choose to reveal the fact they've been attacked without accusing the attacker. And we ask why they do it. So in this case, we saw that it is mainly because of national security needs, okay? Because the fear of escalation if the alleged attacker, if the relation with the alleged attacker they have tension between them. And the other reason might be the safety of sources, of intelligence sources that might get harmed if the victim will expose its attacker. So these two cases I will discuss in just a few more slides. But this is our analytical framework that we established. And then we wanted, in the research, to go and see what is happening in real cases. Okay? So we gathered data based on two really important data sets. And we added new data regarding secrecy. Okay? Like who revealed the attack. Did the attack was revealed? Who revealed the attack? Was it the media? Was it a government? And these kind of variables. And we examined only the past 3 years, but in the bigger project, we will have data about more than 20 years back. And what we found, and that was really interesting, we found that in more than 50% of the cases, which are the blue and the red ones of the pie, we saw that countries do choose to go public. Okay? It means that in over 50% of the cases, countries do see many advantages in revealing the attack. In 21% of the cases, countries choose to reveal the attack without attributing it, and in 37 cases, they choose to reveal and attribute it to a specific attacker. In the other cases, 35% chose to say nothing, like no comment. And an interesting thing that we deal with in the paper is there are cases where countries, as we call it, to claim malfunctions. These were cases where countries suffered an attack, and something that experts thought that was attack, a cyber attack, and the victim said, no, it wasn't the malfunction. The thing that happened is not as a result of cyber attack. OK, and now just the last few slides, the two case studies that we're studying deeply in the paper. The first one is the DNC hack from 2016. And we see, in this case, as I mentioned earlier, the US said publicly that it has been attacked, and we did naming and shaming strategy and gained many benefits from doing so. Okay, we can see that from 2016, the US started to lead and other countries follow by going public and blaming especially Russia, but also China in cyber attacks. And the US, many countries are studying from the US case. And the other case we study in the paper is the Think Health hack in 2018. And that was an interesting case because most of the experts estimated that it was China responsible for the attack. But in every public statement, and which Singapore took really good care of the attack and established a committee of inquiry and was very open about everything that happened and informed its citizens. But in every public statement, and this one is from the chief executive of the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, they said, we cannot reveal the identity of the attacker. Okay? And here we see that Singapore has its own reasons, okay? Like especially the fear of escalating the relationship with China, which led it to be really open about everything besides the identity of the attacker. And now, just some conclusion, but I call it stage one because it's just the beginning. Okay, it's not final conclusions, as this is just a part of a much larger project. We see this project makes us see that that the going public has many benefits. Okay, and it's maybe changing the way we think about cyber conflict, about cyber strategy. It's not as covert space as it used to be. And we see, or we call it the politicization of the attribution problem. We're not the first ones to talk about it, but in this case of going public, we see that the attributing the attack to a specific attacker is a highly political act, much more, or in certain cases, much more than a technical act. And just a few last words about the larger project, which we hope will be very practical, will have very practical results. Okay? In the larger project, we'll have eventually more than 500 cases. We will include non-state actors as well. and other kinds of cyber attacks. And we hope by analyzing such a big amount of data, we will be able to create like an analytic tool that will help and will gain better understanding of the decision-making process of countries, okay, during cyber conflicts, and hopefully will help reducing the uncertainty and help making the entire process more more clear and more with more responsible process. And that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gil. Is there any questions? Let's take two. Clicker. Yes, there is one in the left side.
Thank you very much for the brief. I'm surprised that you haven't considered as one of your factors for decision-making the risk of wrongful attribution.
The wrongful attribution? Yeah. We try to take it into account, like a false flag or something. Yeah. It was one of the comments we received on the paper from our reviewers. In this paper, we're not taking it into consideration since it's not a big amount of cases. Okay, but in the larger project, we do, and we use only open source information. So based on what we have, and of course we cannot see the bigger picture or the entire picture because some of it is obviously classified, but we will and we are trying to identify these cases of false flag and false attributions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there. Let's take from here. Okay, there's.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kjetil Utne from the Norwegian Cyber Defense Forces. It's also an interesting aspect with respect to liability and insurance, that there sometimes could be a footnote on insurance saying that if it's a state actor attribution, there will be limited coverage. So just a consideration for these assessments. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's a good point, and I can say that let's hope it won't be a consideration of countries, right? If that will be a consideration, then we're all in a big problem. Okay.
Because the answers were nice and short, let's take one question more.
Hello. Very interesting discussion. I am interested, did you consider the choice of attribution only within intelligence sharing relationships or alliance processes as one of your factors? And then secondly, did you evaluate the role of private sector cyber intelligence capabilities in creating or reducing the need for a state to publicly attribute, given the private sector having done so effectively on behalf of that entity?
Okay, I'll start from your last question because I'm not sure I understood the first one. We take into consideration the factor of who was the first to reveal the attack or to expose the fact that the attack took place. And in this case, we have the place of private companies, intelligence companies, is really important. But then the second thing we do is to see how the states respond to that. And the first question, I'm not sure I completely understood.
The extent to which states choose to attribute in private discussions only amongst alliance partners or other intelligence sharing relationships versus a public attribution.
Okay, so there's a big discussion, which we touch in the paper, about private attribution and private responses. But for the purpose of our research, as I said before, we can measure or can examine only the things that went to the public, right? That if countries chose to share the information between them, but it's private, I will not know about it, so I will not be able to examine it in an empiric way. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now the third speaker is Brad, and he has a presentation about military cyber operations other than war. And as you can imagine, I have a surprising question for you as well.
I'm not surprised that you have a question.
Okay, now of course there is surprise is already gone, but you're going to talk about what military forces could do, or how military cyber capability could be used during the situation where war is not declared. So basically peacetime, no conflict. And I remember that when I left military forces 10 years ago, we had a very hot topic about that. It was a really pressing issue that what is the role of the military, how it could support the civilian sector, how military forces could be used in cyber domain, etc., etc. And this question is a little bit provocative that, 10 years has passed. We are still talking about the same questions. Why is that? Is there not enough development, or is it so hard question to answer to, or is it there are other reasons?
I don't think it's a hard question to answer if one has full access to information. And let's just use an analogy. We early on began thinking about using aircraft as instruments of combat. I mean, the US Army was basically the first customer for the Wright brothers. That was very visible. That was very evident. It was pretty apparent. It was a big public event. I mean, the first time an airplane came to any town, it was a big event. Everybody came out. There is no equivalent for offensive capabilities. I mean, you're not going to know when it came to your town. It's not going to be advertised, and it's not going to be overt. And so we suffer from two extremes. I think we suffer a lot from the extreme of equating it to nuclear weapons. Oh my God, we could have the electronic Pearl Harbor. So we have to be super, super careful of this. Versus, frankly, the opinion of a lot of those who are experienced leaders in conventional areas who say, that's it? What can you do? I mean, this is what I can do with an aircraft. This is what I can do with a tank. What can you do? Oh, well, I can take a server out. Okay. Why should I care about that? So I think the more we kind of have some clarity, and hopefully can segue into this talk, but I'd like to actually take a moment to answer the question that you asked Max up front, because it kind of comes to what I want to talk about here today, which is, you asked, do nations need military offensive cyberspace capabilities? And I guess my response to that, it reminds me a little bit of, there's a Monty Python skit where a private comes into his lieutenant and he says, please, sir, I'd like to leave the Army. And he says, well, why? And he says, there's people with guns out there. Okay, there's not really a point to organize and equip and train military forces if you're not willing to take them to the extreme application of that capability. So if you're going to develop an offensive capability, that's the consequence of it. Now, does every NATO nation, need offensive cyberspace capabilities? Is a different question, and I would respond to that by illustrating a point. Admiral Nielsen, who spoke this morning, was mentioned. He was a mine warfare expert, a specialist in his early days. I'm pretty sure Hungary does not have any mine warfare capability, okay? But they benefit from being in a military alliance where there are allies who can use mine warfare capabilities to protect sea lines of communication. That's one of the great things about the alliance, is the cooperation and capability development to say, how can we best utilize each other's capabilities to get the benefit? There are capabilities the United States and really a few other nations are going to develop because they are about strategic power projection. Jay Healy used earlier the example of flying B-52s past China. Okay? To do that, the United States had to have, in effect, a global strategic bombing capability. And to talk about what Admiral Rogers was mentioned this morning, what does that involve? That meant to fly by China, the US had to have the technical means, which means the aircraft. Believe me, if you've been involved with aircraft programs, they're long-term. When did the US start working on the B-52s? It was probably, you can find the paperwork going back to the 40s, okay? And we're still flying them. C-130s, what a beautiful aircraft. Still flying, still providing value, still being adapted. Virtually nothing on a C-130 that's flying today is original equipment. But it's an airframe, it's a program, et cetera. So the technical measures is part of it. You have to have capacity, which means the trained force, the force that knows how to take off as an organized group of aircraft and to navigate where they need to do and deal with refueling if that's an issue and all of that. And also protection. They didn't go there without some sort of combat fighter escort. Operational processes, the processes of organizing and planning that. Now, they didn't drop bombs on anything, which means they didn't do weaponeering and targeteering, but they did every other element of mission planning, including, for example, what happens if an aircraft goes down. And finally, the legal and policy frameworks that was mentioned by Admiral Rogers, which is you had a way in which you could use that capability and apply it within the rule of law. And that really kind of gets to the heart of what my talk is about today. So if I can.
But actually, no, because I didn't surprise you with the first question. Now I have another to you. That you mentioned right now that as the same way as with other capabilities, maybe not every ally should have cyber capability, but some other nations could support in this regard.
Right.
Do you think this analogy applies here in the cyber domain?
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
We as Estonia, for example, cannot have any cyber capability and rely on another country.
Or you could have some awesome ones.
Yeah.
Because the barrier to entry here is much different than it is in other domains. Your barrier to entry to have strategic airlift is considerable. It's probably, you know, one aircraft would be over your entire defense budget, I'm sure. So that's not an option.
I actually think this statement is arguable, but let's hope that somebody from the auditorium will you know, argue about that.
Okay.
But please enter to the presentation.
Thank you. I have to start with this disclaimer. Now, this is on all the papers that any NATO employee provides, but I think it's important we do it today to understand that in this talk, I'm really going beyond the envelope of what NATO as an alliance has agreed. Getting 29 nations to agree to something is a time-consuming process. Yes, it's time-consuming. I also think it's invaluable because when we've established consensus, we have really a strong foundation on which to move forward, and it's an important factor. But what I'm going to talk about today really is my own reflections looking at where we are with military operations. And this really kind of comes from one of the first things when I was second lieutenant in the Air Force in the early 80s, to kind of do officer advancement, we all learned a little trick, which was we signed up for the Marine, I think it was called the Marine Corps Company Grade Officers course, which you could take by correspondence. It was like the first officer training after getting commissioned you could take. And it was relatively easy to pass. You just read the books and went in and took the test. And I think it was the second or third volume that came in the mail. It said military operations other than war. And you know, that term, although it's somewhat fallen out of style, so I referenced JP Joint Publication 3-7, which was the US publication on fundamental military operations other than war doctrine. That's been superseded. That's not a term that's used. I think it's a good point to kind of use this as a thought piece to launch into what I think is the fundamental question we're continuing to ask, which is what is the appropriate use of military capabilities in this area of cyberspace. So let's talk about, again, the ultimate use of military capabilities is for that one thing at top. It's war. It's large-scale combat operations. And in my mind, if What we do in terms of conducting military operations means we need to be able to operate in land, we need to be able to operate at sea, we need to be able to operate in air. If cyberspace is an area that can affect our operational capability, it absolutely needs to be within the framework. To me, it's unthinkable that we would say we have to have the military that can operate at that extreme end of the spectrum of large-scale armed conflict. And by the way, we're not going to deal with any of the cyberspace stuff. We're just not going to go there. It just doesn't make any sense. Part of it is because you can add value. There's no doubt, no matter what the effect might be, it's very likely that it can have at least a supporting effect in the context of an overall operation. But I would argue, if we were in a large-scale conflict of NATO, I think you would find a lot of things coming together, including acceptance of doing things in cyberspace that we might not be willing to talk about in a non-war environment, which leads us to this question of what's happening below that line. Well, the things that happen below that line, according to JP 7, was basically two categories, which was the bottom line is about support, humanitarian assistance and support to civil authorities, which is essentially the military playing 100% a supporting role to some other activity. So that's airlifting non-combatants out of or providing earthquake relief or something like that. Natural disaster relief, even domestically. And then the other category is called deter war and prevent conflict. And doesn't that, I mean, we just had a session talking about, is cyber deterrence valid? Is it not valid? I want to say this talk is not about whether that theory is valid. It's not about policy questions, because those are questions that should be addressed by policymakers. But for the military decision makers, we need to say what is happening below this line and what are the appropriate roles for the military and frankly, what are the inappropriate roles for the military. And I'll use the example, again, from the Air Force. Some of you may be aware that there was a time in the early existence of the Army Air Corps in the US where it was enlisted to provide postal service, high-speed postal service, carrying the mail inside the US. Now, if you're familiar with that story, you know that it was a disaster. For one thing, and it was a disaster because it was stretching the capacity of our aircraft capability. You know, it was to do that day in, day out, you know, means dealing with flying in bad weather in areas where we hadn't worked out the whole navigation and airspace control arrangements. So pilots were taking a very risky endeavor, and ultimately it was abandoned as really a bad idea. There's an example of a military capability used in an appropriate way, and we need to make sure that we don't have the resources to spend military capability on inappropriate tasks. So let's talk, this is the US definition. NATO has a taxonomy for cyberspace operations, relatively similar. Operations of defense networks, offensive cyberspace, defensive cyberspace. I think we can recognize that all of those things can play a supporting role to forces that are essentially the leading capability in an operation. So it absolutely makes sense. We're always going to need defense network operations to provide the command and control capability to any of defense forces, however they're being employed. And likewise, we would want to defend those capabilities. So the network operations piece and the defense of those networks is a key piece. Offensive, we can certainly come up with viable, say, non-controversial denial sorts of things that might also play a supporting role. But are there operations where the cyberspace would take the lead? Because I think this is really the area we're starting to explore in the discussions already just today. Because we recognize that the threats we're facing in cyberspace, a lot of this is below the level of large-scale armed conflict. So far, we haven't seen a cyberspace electronic war for a harbor. So what we're seeing is things that are far lower than that in terms of magnitude of damage and risk, scale. Very often, these are affecting systems that are outside the military span of control. And these are not things that lend themselves to conventional military responses. Okay? An attack on Sony Pictures does not generate the basis to say, well, let's have a flyby, or let's bring a naval flotilla, or do a blockade, or something like that. You know, they're not proportional responses. Now, if we look at what's doing in this, so the first two, the operations, not a controversial things. In the US, they defined cyberspace, defensive cyberspace operations in 3 categories: internal defensive measures, response actions, and defensive non-defense cyberspace. And I want to just poke at those for a moment. Fundamentally, internal defensive measures are part of running the network. Now, you can organize it in a different way, the way the US has, where you have essentially specialist defense teams. A number of militaries are going down this line where you essentially have experts who can come in and help the network operators, rapid reaction teams. I'm a little personally concerned about that, because if you look at it from a capability maturity model approach, it's really level 0, which is response by heroes. Ultimately, you want to get to the point where the network operators operate the network securely by default. They know how to protect themselves. The next is response actions. And if you look at the US literature on this, response actions, I would argue, are basically offensive cyberspace operations, because they're talking about carrying out effects in a non-cooperative system. In other words, somebody who didn't agree to be a target, somebody else's system. At that point, I think the difference between offensive and response actions is, from a legal standpoint, from a technical capability standpoint, from a force employment standpoint, I don't see what the difference is. Because they fundamentally, it comes back to this idea, and that's kind of a key point that I try to make in the paper. It's about understanding whether or not it involves the threat or use of force. Because if we talk about offensive capabilities, and particularly if we start to have a discussion about who the alternatives are to the military forces in conducting offensive capabilities in cyberspace, I think you quickly see the options are not very attractive. Intelligence agencies, well, actually, that's where you immediately get into this intel gain-loss dilemma, where, in fact, they're very often prefer to keep the system up and running as an exploitation source, not to deny it and lose that access and lose that opportunity. Industry, do we really want to encourage that? This is literally equivalent to cyber mercenaries. Is that the way we want to go? Or do we want to essentially leave it to a white hat army of essentially volunteers and people who operate on the basis of goodwill, which is in effect like a militia in a way? Neither one of those options is attractive in a conventional area, and I would say neither is attractive in the cyberspace. Because when you look at our military forces, what are they expert in? At least those of us who are involved with the forces of Western democracies, members of the NATO alliance, we are committed that when we do employ military forces as providing the use or threat of force, we do that within the rule of law. And it turns out, just like that example of having a group of B-52s fly by China, the ability to organize, train, equip, and have that as a practicable, plannable, executable capability cannot happen if you wait for the conflict to develop it. These are long-term things. Even though you can say, well, there are effects you can create, anybody can write software in a matter of a few hours. Well, good luck, go try that. I mean, the point is, it doesn't matter what the technical mean is, you have to have the whole picture. You have to have the ability to organize it. You have to have trained operators. You have to have an operational decision-making process. You need to be able to target it. You need to be able to perform battle damage assessment. You need to be able to have possibly positive control on its capability to be able to turn it off. And you may need to have the ability to confirm that it's a proportional use of the capability. These are all factors that military forces practice and are used to dealing with in applying the rules of engagement and the rules of law and how we use our forces, and so it absolutely makes sense that we use this in cyberspace as well. So if we can do it in land, sea, air, I would argue it's absolutely clear we need to do it in cyberspace. And you can see from the discussions that we've had today and other elements, as you can see, the US idea of defending forward is starting to recognize there are some benefits in using this capability, but to use it as a military capability, which means it is an instrument of national strategy. Absolutely. Which means the policymakers are making the decision about whether or not it's an appropriate response to an event like compromise of election systems. That's what they're there for. But the military's job is to be able to do that in a reliable, effective, repeatable, predictable fashion that can keep us operating. So when it is used as an instrument of state, it's not essentially rogue. It's not running out in the open. It's not uncontrolled. That leaves the last category, which is also a very popular topic in discussions of the use of cyber capabilities, which is the defense of non-defense cyberspace. And this is where I think unhelpful analogies, so the cyber force on force is one of the most frequent examples of an unhelpful analogy for cyberspace operations. We're rarely going to use offensive capabilities as a one-for-one against another offensive capability, I would argue. But let's use an example. The challenge given to a commander is to defend a power plant from attack. Now, if I need to defend that from the land, I can do that by positioning land forces to protect it as a physical asset. I can protect it from the sea by having maritime forces there, protecting the sea lines of communications and the maritime approaches. I can protect it from the air by having ground-based air defense and having air coverage over that target. But if I want to protect the information systems involved in that power plant, does it really make sense to put that in the hands of a soldier, somebody from the military? I would argue not. Simply, we need to look at the numbers. How many military cyberspace operators, even in the defensive side, how many of them routinely deal with industrial control systems? And you and I both know the answer to that is either none or virtually none. In the meantime, there are thousands of people who do that in industry. And you can say, well, if they got attacked, they're obviously not doing a very good job. You mistake the fact that if you are operating a critical national infrastructure, it's not in your interest to have unpredictable things happen disrupting your systems, okay? So believe me, I've done studies back in the 90s of electric power industry and financial services industries, infrastructures and information systems in the US. And what you find is those folks really understand anomalies and how to detect them quickly and how to respond to them and how to keep service running, because that's the essence of what they provide. If they can't provide that, they can't continue to operate that. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a prospect of a massive attack or something like that, but it still comes back to, is this the appropriate use of military capabilities? And I would argue not. And so that's why, in a way, I kind of actually didn't answer my question in the paper, which was what are the military operations other than war for cyberspace forces. But I think it really, actually, you need to put it in terms of what are the appropriate roles for military offensive and defensive capabilities below the level of large-scale armed conflict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I take the opportunity to ask you the first question.
Okay.
Actually, you know, before I came back to the government service, I was consulting governments around the world in cyber security matters. And every time when a country wanted to create a cyber security capability, the political strategic leadership usually didn't include military to these discussions.
Right.
Because they simply couldn't see the role. They know very well that military is very good in breaking things. So basically, the offensive capability that's considered to be part of the military broader capability. But it was really hard to find the way how military could be used. So my question is that, what do you think, how much military can actually solve the problems or challenges that countries have in their cybersecurity field at the state level? what is the, I don't know how you can answer that, percentage or some naming capabilities, but is the key of solving the pressing challenges in the military forces, or countries should find the solutions from other sectors? So it's pretty much the question that you raised there, that who you gonna call? I remember very well, you know, this movie, Ghostbusters,
yes,
exactly.
Yes.
It was one of my favorite movies when I was a child, and you know, who you gonna call? Ghostbusters.
Exactly.
So is this, you know, the capability actually somewhere else, and we are focusing maybe too much to the military sector? Or
I think I mean, it all depends. As you've heard, that's an acceptable answer to some of the questions today. First of all, I think those who talk about a whole of government response are dealing with the appropriate way to talk about not just cyberspace issues, but really any national security issue. And I like to use the analogy of a tent. If you prop up a tent with one pole, and that pole gets knocked out, you know, the tent's going to collapse. If the tent is held up through a bunch of poles, you're not dependent on one pole bearing the weight of the capability. And so I think the answer is the more options that a nation has, and likewise, as Dr. Misiroli mentioned earlier this afternoon, the more options that the alliance has about how we can respond to things. You know, there's a theory that says essentially the best strategy in general is preserving your options. Essentially, any option, any strategy that requires you to end up with fewer options than you started with should be seriously questioned about whether that's a valid strategy. Now, life isn't like that, you know, there's no loss and there's no trade-offs, but I think that's my response is, first of all, if you are using computers and communications and information systems to conduct your military operations, which you are, you absolutely need to be able to operate those in a secure and reliable and resilient fashion, because that's one of the easiest ways you can defeat the capabilities in any other form. So operating it reliably and then defending it appropriately, whether offensive is the appropriate tool, if your nation needs that pole in your overall national security cyberspace strategy, is really a decision for each nation to make on its own.
But let's take a very concrete example. You pointed out in your presentation the power plant case. That the military should somehow have a role in defending this power plant. How can military actually do it? Isn't it so that the best knowledge is among these operators who operate the power plant and who protect them, who have built the IT system for the power plant? So what military can actually do there?
Well, you're making my case right there, which was essentially, if I want to provide protection from land attack, sea attack, air attack, I can use that with conventional military forces. To protect it from cyberspace attack, it's not clear to me that it's an easy reach to say that's an appropriate use of military capabilities. I think chasing after the military solution actually is probably less productive and a less effective use of the resources than pursuing other lines of improvement.
But if we can go back one of your earlier statements, that every country doesn't need to have cyber capability, does it mean actually that if there is a power plant that needs to be protection, then another country could use their military capability actually to protect that?
Well, again, I don't think all nails have to be driven in with military hammers. And this is an example, you know, and you've seen it here in this own, and many, the newer members of the EU have benefited from not just the economic expertise or value that the EU has brought in terms of investment, but that investment typically came with capability or capacity building support through non-military means. And even when nations join NATO, we provide capability and capacity building support for the military side. You know, it doesn't have to have a military solution.
I'd like actually to address the same questions to other panelists. What do you think that how many solutions could be found in the military capabilities for the pressing cybersecurity challenges these days? Maybe? Yeah.
I can give example from Israel, in which in Israel the military is responsible for really specific areas, and the main responsibility is on a national civilian agency, the National Cyber Directorate, which in case our power plants gets attacked, this authority is responsible for its protection and for dealing with the consequences of the attack. So the military is not...
They are the Ghostbusters there.
Yeah, yeah. And who do you call them?
Yeah,
yeah. And they have the number, like a short number, so every citizen can call. And especially if you are a critical infrastructure operator or something like that, this is the one authority that you work with. Mm-hmm. No military involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think there are a number of really interesting questions here, but the first one to answer is actually what would the military be capable of, right? And how much do you want to invest in it? And what we have seen is that we have seen a wide range of countries establishing military cyber organizations, whether these are full-fledged commands or branches or services, around the time actually of austerity, right? You might see this in the post-Stuxnet era, but it was also an area where a wide range of countries were still facing military budget cuts, where truly the Cyber Command or other similar organization was seen as a way to remain kind of at the forefront of technological advancement and military capability, right? The idea that, hey, with spending a few million, we might still be able to be active in the military domain. And I think what many have come to realize, like, hey, it's not that easy. And it goes also to a conversation that we had over lunch about, hey, what are the actual requirements to conduct operations before we can actually think about its use, and what does it require to actually establish an organization? And what we see is this funny paradox that often comes up is that, yes, the barriers of entry to achieve any type of effect in any point in time against any target in a very opportunistic manner, yes, that's relatively low. And so if we would then think about potential force projection, you actually need relatively little, right? Certain actors can now, which they weren't able to do before, project force truly into other countries that are far away from them. They don't need that infrastructure. Yet, and that goes to almost any nation or any nation that is within the alliance, that's not the type of operation that you want to conduct. What you want to conduct are specific operations with a specific target at a specific point in time that are strategically valuable, whether that is for, I don't know, defensive purposes, preemptive, preventive strike, or compellence purposes, coercive purposes, or more signaling purposes. But it fits within a broad set of criteria. And to meet every single criteria, whether that's around collateral damage and so on, it requires a disproportionate increase in requirements. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, we see a complete change in landscape. It's like, yes, I do believe that there is a wide range of use of potentially using military cyber operations and where the military can be valuable, right? I do believe that there are certain ways where we can actually think about preemptive and preventive strikes. But it requires such an investment that we have so badly understood so far, and both people, especially people, and not just technical, and also in indeed tooling and like both exploit and implants, but also in infrastructure, understanding the targets. The amount of investment that is required to actually understand the target space is enormous. And then lastly, in the organizational capacity, how can we motivate still some individual flexibility whilst many of these people are still in a kind of rigorous military environment? Mm-hmm. And I think it seems few organizations across the NATO alliance at least, and beyond as well, have actually really got that in place. Mm. And that's a necessary step to then think about how we're going to use that.
So you are basically saying that the cyber capability that should be there is not actually as it should?
Indeed. What I'm saying is indeed that considering the public investment made in military cyber organizations, if those figures truly reflect the actual amount of money that is invested in military cyber organizations that will not be enough to actually operate effectively.
I also,
so please go ahead.
I also remember from your paper that you mentioned that it's not that countries have created new cyber capabilities, but they have actually reorganized the military capabilities under the name of Cyber Command, or whatever is the name of this capability.
Of course, yes. And there are a number of implications that come with that, right? So just to one final point on this, that can have great benefits. Because actually by rebranding, you might also make it a more attractive environment for potentially young people or people who just graduate, whatever, to come in and want to work for it, right? That rebranding, and some people will say it is actually valuable for some form of postering as well, right? It's difficult to showcase a capability. It is difficult to parade computer codes on the streets of Moscow, but what we can show is the organizational capacity and the strategies and so on. So there is a value. But we've also seen practices that will have to be changed. For example, with this reorganization, trying to put the most important technical minds in kind of one unit, it might actually be an attractive place for potentially private sector companies to actually recruit from there, because now you have a one shop where you want to go to because you know that the organization is pooled. If that happens, and there seem to be countries where that is happening, what we'll then see is that actually we see this kind of brain drain where the centralization has actually led to dynamics that no government wanted.
It's always clear that there is never enough time for cyber discussions, but we have still 8 minutes to take questions, so let's take questions from the auditorium. Yes, please, in front here.
Thank you. Isn't there then a place, I mean, to Gil's point about Israel, obviously people working in the civil agency probably went through a 2.0.0. There is a big ecosystem in Israel between business, military, and which a small country has to do. Estonia, same thing. A very big country has the money, like, say, America. But the medium countries, Britain, Germany, wouldn't there a natural solution be the reservist system, but different, obviously, to what we think historically? Historically, the reservist is less prepared than a soldier. But in cyber, to your point, he would be more prepared because he does it on a daily basis and then gets called. Wouldn't that be an approach that should be seriously considered?
In my opinion, and we did some research on it, on the Israeli case, I think the reserve duty might be a good solution, or a good option in this case, as you suggested. In the Israeli case, we do have, we call it in English reserve officers, but they are ones that serving in the military during their studies in the university. So it's a different kind of service. And then it gives a good solution for the manpower problem, because the military pays for their studies in the university, and they're committed for twice as long, at least twice as long service in the military. And they get so highly educated during the service, and they then appointed in the units that need them the most. And that makes it very, it's a good mechanism for the military to preserve the knowledge within. He pays them to study and then use that knowledge. So I think it can be both ways might work in this case. Even the reserves that come to serve every few months or years, and this, we call it the academic reserve, okay, in Israel.
Max had a question?
Yeah, I got 2 points of that. One on the reserve system and then on the private sector. I fully agree that, of course, it can provide certainly initial operational capacity, can help with also knowledge exchanges, build broader cultural understanding. But there is this terrific RAND report, which I believe was published 2 or 3 years ago, also talking about the limitations. And one of them is, of course, that when we really think about cyber operations, it's about better understanding your own networks than anyone else and better understanding your adversary networks than your adversary does. And that means that we can't have kind of a plug-and-play solution, right? You can't have reservists coming in at the moment that already there is a problem or that you want to go on the offense, because it is about understanding your own network and your adversaries' networks. And that creates some significant limitations that I think a wide number of states still have to deal with. I think the role of the private sector is inherent. Whether you're a larger state, whether that's the US, or whether you're a small state, they will inherently come in, and for very, very good reasons. I think one of the key interesting things here is really on how are you going to use private sector tools, and particularly when they are not developed for military cyber operations, right? Often we draw we think that a typical pen testing is very similar to how a military operation is conducted. It's not, right? They have very different incentive structure and operate in a very different way. One is billable hours, we want to achieve within a day, whatever, we need to come up with a report, all those kind of things. The other, it's about stability, it's stealthiness, and it's ensuring mission effectiveness. It changes the dynamics on what kind of tools we want to use and how we want to deploy them as well. And it also changes potentially the dynamics on what kind of people we might want to use and whether we want to retrain them or whether we want to bring in new people altogether. And I think some of those dynamics are particularly important for exactly those middle states. Because those large states, as we've known, and unfortunately from leaks such as the shadow brokers, we know that the US can build their own unique exploit orchestrators to specifically use their frameworks for certain operations. But many of the middle powers, and certainly small powers, don't have that capacity. So they might have to rely more on private sector tools that were not necessarily developed for purely military implications or applications.
Mm-hmm. Brad?
Yeah, I just want to jump in for a couple of points. My father, actually, his last assignment as an active duty U.S. Air Force officer was as an advisor to an Air National Guard unit, which provided deployable communications and information systems. And he loved that experience because actually all of his staff were people who worked for, at that time, as we called it, the phone company. They were all telephone company engineers. They worked that mission for decades, okay? So maybe they only practiced one weekend a month, but they did that year in and year out. And so they actually developed a very high level of expertise. And I think if you look in certainly the US, the Army National Guard, the Air National Guard, you will find that's where we start to bring in some of the depth of specialty expertise that actually gives us a tremendous, essentially, depth of capacity. And I think there's 2 points from that. Why were the phone company guys doing it once a month? Because it helped with an additional pension. And particularly in the IT world, where turnover and rotation happens a lot, there can be very attractive benefits of sticking with it for a few decades. So I think actually you'll find the skill sets can be quite easily exportable. I think it's a great model, and I totally support that being used. Sorry to differ, but I think it has a lot of benefits.
Yeah, you had a comment?
No, I think we actually largely agree here, right? As I was saying, it's useful for initial capacity building. It's useful for knowledge sharing, for cultural understanding, all these dimensions. But we have to be very careful of thinking that this can be a plug-and-play solution, that they can come in at the moment that we desperately need them. That's too late. That's
no,
really
they have to train that mission on a regular basis. They can't just come in at the time of the crisis.
I'm sure that there are many other questions in the auditorium, but unfortunately the time is up and I have to finish here because otherwise the CCD COE will not ask me in the future to moderate any panels. So let's finish here, and if you have any other questions, there are many events around the world on cybersecurity, and if you are not going to take part of these, the next year there is another event in Tallinn. So keep your questions for about a year. So thank you very much, and let's give big applause to the panelists.